Imagine the scene, a press conference in Greece. The European Union's chief prosecutor steps up to the microphone, her expression is grave, and she unveils a story straight out of a crime thriller. A shadowy network of Chinese criminal organizations, she says, has launched an industrial-scale invasion of Europe. They've masterminded the single biggest customs fraud in EU history, a slow-motion heist that has cost taxpayers almost €1 billion. It's a perfect story. A clear foreign enemy, a massive crime, a threat to the very economic fabric of the Union. It's the kind of headline that writes itself. There's just one problem. When you look closer at the crime itself, at the precise moment the fraud actually happens, it doesn't take place in a factory in Shanghai or on a container ship in the middle of the ocean. It happens on a piece of paper, a customs declaration form, filled out and signed, not by some distant gangster, but by a European company, in a European port, often with the help of a European official. And that simple, boring detail changes everything. It turns a dramatic story about a foreign invasion into a much more uncomfortable story about a spectacular failure from within. Suddenly, the real question isn't how these criminals are attacking the system. It's who, on the inside, left the door wide open for them. Okay, let's unpack this. We are doing a deep dive today into, well, the systemic vulnerabilities within the European Union's customs enforcement mechanisms.
Our mission, really, is to trace how the EU's own internal structure, its regulations, its lack of harmonization, and its enforcement gaps, how these actually enable large-scale, massive import fraud.
Yeah, and crucially, how the focus often shifts away, away from those uncomfortable internal failures towards these external narratives.
Exactly, that narrative simplification you mentioned.
It's fascinating how easily it becomes a story about a foreign threat when, what we're seeing again and again is that the vulnerability is entirely systemic. It's baked in.
Baked into the EU's own rules.
Yes, precisely. Yep. It resides not just in the, let's say, ingenuity of sophisticated criminal networks operating internationally, but specifically in the EU's own regulatory inconsistencies and the enforcement gaps across its 27 member states.
So we need to look past those headlines.
We really do. We need to examine the actual mechanism of the fraud and how these internal structural issues turn what should be pretty mundane customs procedures into these gaping billion-euro loopholes. Okay, let's start there then. With the scale, let's anchor this with the hard numbers because they really demonstrate the scale of the failure. We're talking about an almost billion-euro figure just from one investigation.
That's right. The investigation that prompted that traumatic press conference you mentioned, known as Calypso, it was led by the European chief prosecutor, Laura Kövesi.
And that confirmed losses over 800 million.
Exceeding 800 million, yes, in unpaid duties. And they seized thousands of containers, too. This is, it's financial crime on an industrial scale. It really is.
Not just a few dodgy imports.
No, absolutely not. And we must emphasize, this goes far beyond small-time smuggling. Kövesi specifically warned that this crime is driven by highly organized international criminal networks.
Right.
And crucially, the investigations involve local officials and bankers within Europe.
Local officials and bankers, that's key.
It is. But to appreciate the true scope, the real financial damage, we have to connect this 800 million customs loss to the broader world of value-added tax, or VAT fraud.
Ah, the infamous VAT gap.
Exactly. The EU 27 VAT compliance gap, that's the money that should have been collected, but, well, wasn't, was estimated at an astronomical 89 billion in 2022.
89 billion.
Billion. With a beat. And import VAT fraud is officially confirmed as one of the largest contributors to that deficit. It's a major driver.
That is just a colossal hole in the common budget. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it seems that even when the European Public Prosecutor's Office, the EPPO, is trying to follow the money, trying to follow that internal trail of complicity.
Which is its job.
Right, which is its job. But certain legal systems within member states can act as absolute roadblocks. Is that right?
That structural obstruction is perfectly highlighted by the situation in Greece, actually, where that opening press conference took place.
Okay.
Kövesi explicitly reported that Article 86 of the Greek Constitution is actively obstructing the full reach of her investigations.
Actively obstructing on major cases.
Yes. And these are not minor inquiries. They include high-profile cases like the OPCOPY subsidy scandal and Contract 717, which is related to that tragic Tempe railway disaster.
We need to pause on Article 86. What exactly is the constitutional weight of that article? Why does it effectively grant immunity or, let's say, protection in the context of financial crime against the EU?
Well, Article 86 is a powerful constitutional provision. It's powerful because it grants only the parliament, the political body, the power to prosecute sitting or former government ministers.
Only parliament, not the independent judiciary.
Correct. Now, in theory, this is designed to maintain political stability, maybe prevent vindictive or partisan legal attacks against former leaders. That's the idea.
But in practice?
In practice, as Kovesi stated very clearly, because of this hurdle, investigations into the misuse of EU funds could not go as far as they should have. Her words.
So the EPPO hits a wall.
Essentially, yes. The EPPO is designed to handle these big transnational financial crimes against the EU's interests, anything over 10 million across multiple states. But its effectiveness relies heavily on national legal systems being willing to reform, willing to cooperate, particularly when the trail leads towards, well, political figures or high-level officials.
It highlights a fundamental tension, then, between the EPPO's mandate and, I guess, sovereign legal protections.
Absolutely. It's a core conflict.
Okay, so if legal barriers are one problem, potentially protecting internal actors, what about the administrative system, the one that's supposed to be fraud-proof? Does the actual machinery of enforcement hold up against this kind of slow-motion heist?
Well, the evidence suggests that administrative failures are just as damaging, often simply due to, frankly, inertia and delay.
Delay? How so?
Data from Eurofisc, that's the Internal Fraud Monitoring Network, shows an alarming delay problem. Get this. Over 20% of VT fraud occurs after the fraud is initially detected.
Wait, after it's detected?
Yes. But before the corresponding VAT identification number can actually be invalidated.
20% of the money is lost in the lag time, while the system knows there's fraud.
Precisely. That's the window.
Why the delay? What causes that lag?
It often comes down to national legislation.
Yeah.
Some member states require these protracted preliminary investigations before a VAT ID can finally be canceled.
So the bureaucracy gets in the way.
Exactly. And fraudsters know this. They absolutely exploit that window. It becomes a kind of legally protected time period where they can continue their illicit operations until the system finally catches up. This slowness, this administrative drag, is just as crippling as outright legal obstruction sometimes.
And beyond just procedural slowness, you mentioned inconsistencies earlier, there's massive institutionalized inconsistency in penalties, right? Which sounds like it basically creates a competitive market for organized crime.
Oh, the divergence in administrative penalties is shocking. It really is. Audits detail these vast differences in penalties for abusing simplified import procedures across just 5 member states they looked at: Belgium, Ireland, France, Italy, and Slovenia.
And the difference was?
Penalties were found to be at least 10 times higher in Italy and Slovenia compared to Belgium, France, or Ireland.
10 times higher. So the EU is effectively, if accidentally, signaling to organized crime where the cheapest place is to break the law.
That's exactly what it looks like. It creates an incentive structure for criminals to engage in what's called import point shopping.
Import point shopping, okay.
Yeah, organized networks deliberately choose the entry points, the ports or airports, where the consequences for misinvoicing or underdeclaring are financially negligible, or where the risk of having to post a significant financial guarantee is lowest.
Which completely undermines the whole idea of a single market, a common customs shield.
It totally demolishes it. This lack of uniformity, this inconsistency, it's not just a small quirk. It's a fundamental flaw that breaks the shield.
Okay, now that we've established the frankly shocking financial damage and the structural flaws that enable it, let's drill down into the single critical act, the thing that allows this damage to occur, the deliberate misuse of paperwork, this financial crime called Trade Mis-invoicing, or TMI.
Right.
What does TMI actually look like when it's executed by, say, a European company importing goods?
TMI is, at its heart, the simplest concept, but is also the most powerful criminal tool in this context. It's defined as simply misrepresenting the price, or the quantity, or the quality of imports or exports on official documents.
Specifically, the customs declarations and invoices.
Exactly, that piece of paper we talked about. This is the act that formally constitutes the customs fraud within the EU's jurisdiction. It happens right there on that form.
So TMI is the means, the method. What are the motivations behind it? I mean, beyond just trying to avoid a tariff.
Well, the primary motivations are generally threefold. First, yes, evading tariffs and fixed customs duties. That's a big one. Second, avoiding quotas. Limits placed on restricted goods, often things like textiles or certain agricultural products.
Right, getting around trade limits.
Exactly. And third, And this is really critical, serving as the foundational element of trade-based money laundering, or TBML.
Ah, the money laundering connection.
Yes. Global Financial Integrity, GFI, they've estimated that TMI accompanies over 87% of all illicit financial flows globally. It's the dominant method for moving criminal funds across borders using trade.
So TMI isn't just about, say, tax avoidance. It's actually the thing that generates the criminal funds that TBML then tries to clean up.
That's the critical distinction. You've hit it exactly. TMI generates the proceeds of crime by evading the duties and taxes owed. That unpaid duty, that's now illegal gain. TBML is the subsequent process that disguises or conceals those newly generated criminal proceeds by using seemingly legitimate trade transactions.
There are two sides of the same coin.
Absolutely. And the crime starts right there on that customs form.
Okay, let's walk through the mechanics. Maybe using that classic example you mentioned, the overvaluation scheme involving, say, an Indian importer, a U.S. exporter, and maybe a Mauritius intermediary. How does TMI generate the illicit proceeds there?
Okay, let's imagine a legitimate transaction. Say $1 million worth of cars moving from a U.S. exporter to an Indian importer.
Yeah.
Pretty standard.
Right.
Now, the criminal network introduces an intermediary company, often based in a jurisdiction known for, let's say, financial secrecy, like Mauritius in this example.
Shell company.
Effectively, yes. So when the Indian importer pays for the cars, they deliberately overvalue the transaction on their customs declaration in India.
Huh.
They declare the cost as, say, a $1.5 million, using the intermediary's inflated invoice as justification.
Even though the cars are only worth $1 million. So $1.5 million leaves India, but only $1 million goes to the U.S. exporter for the cars. Where does that extra $500,000 go?
That excess $500,000 is immediately siphoned off. It's directed straight to an offshore account controlled by the criminal network, likely linked to that Mauritius intermediary.
Okay, so the crime itself, the underlying crime, is the customs fraud in India. The false declaration.
Exactly. That false declaration allowed the criminal to illegally transfer $500,000 out of India, maybe evading currency controls or taxes there. That $500,000 is now officially illegal income, proceeds of crime.
And the wiring of the funds is the money laundering part.
Yes. The act of diverting and wiring those funds into the offshore entity constitutes the placement and subsequent layering stages of money laundering. The customs fraud created the illegal asset. The trade transaction disguised its origin and movement.
And the crucial insight for our deep dive today is this. Whether it's overvaluation to move money out of a jurisdiction like in India, or undervaluation to avoid duties coming into Europe.
Which is what we see a lot of here.
Right. The legal responsibility for the accuracy of that paperwork that customs form filled out in a European port rests squarely on the European company, the importer.
Absolutely, 100%. The European customs system fundamentally operates on trust. It relies on the European importer to accurately declare the goods and pay the correct duties. The legal locus of the fraud, the specific moment the crime is committed within the EU, is the deliberate misrepresentation signed off on that customs form by the European entity.
Okay, but what if the European importer claims they were acting in good faith? Maybe they say, look, I just received these invoices from my supplier from this third party, and I simply copied the values onto the customs declaration. Does that absolve them? Does good faith work as a defense?
Well, the Court of Justice of the EU, the CJEU, has been very, very clear that essentially, no, it does not.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
We can look at a specific case, the JP Mali case. It concerned a Hungarian company importing bicycles and parts.
Bicycles, okay.
They declared the goods as originating in Taiwan, but OLAF, the EU's anti-fraud office, investigated and found the true origin was China.
Which matters because of anti-dumping duties.
Precisely. By claiming Taiwanese origin, they avoided significant anti-dumping duties applicable to Chinese bikes. The company argued they had relied on incorrect documents provided by others. They claimed good faith.
And what did the CJEU rule? How did the court see it?
The CJEU ruled firmly against the Hungarian importer. They stated that significant penalties up to 50% of the underpaid duties were effective and, crucially, dissuasive.
50% is a hefty penalty.
It is. And the court essentially confirmed that economic operators, importers, have a non-negotiable legal duty. They must take all necessary measures to ensure the data they provide to customs authorities is correct, regardless of what documents they might have been provided by suppliers or intermediaries.
So the buck stops firmly with the European importer.
Absolutely. The burden of proof and the ultimate accountability rests with the company importing the goods into the EU, which, again, reinforces our central theme here. The The point of fraud is internal. It rests on the European actor who signs that form.
Okay. So the system is breached when local European actors deliberately misuse these trade facilitation mechanisms. Let's look much closer now at these simplified import customs procedures that are being exploited, because this seems to be where that fragmentation we talked about really meets criminal opportunity head on.
Yes, we absolutely most focus on two major systems. These were designed for speed and efficiency, but they become magnets for fraud. The first is Customs Procedure 42, or CP42.
CP42.
And the second is the Import One-Stop Shop, or iOS, which is critical for e-commerce.
Right, e-commerce is huge now. Okay, first, explain CP42. What is it, and why is it so appealing to fraudsters?
Okay, CP42 is a voluntary mechanism. It's intended to facilitate the internal market, make trade smoother within the EU. It grants a VAT exemption for goods imported into member state. Hey, let's call it the state of importation.
Like, say, goods arriving in Rotterdam.
Exactly. But these goods are explicitly destined for final sale or consumption in member state B, maybe France or Germany.
Okay, so the VAT isn't paid in Rotterdam.
Correct. The VAT is supposed to be accounted for and paid later in state B, the final destination state. The weakness is, well, it's pretty obvious when you think about it.
If they claim the exemption in state A.
Right. If the criminal network claims the VAT exemption at import in state A, Rotterdam, but then state B, France or Germany, either fails to track the goods properly or the company simply vanishes.
Then the goods enter the EU market completely untaxed.
Precisely. They just melt into the internal market, VAT-free.
And this leads us directly back to that phrase you used. Import point shopping. How does the lack of harmonization in the rules for CP42 specifically create this critical exposure?
It really centers on the use of tax representative.
Tax representatives, what are they?
Okay, so CP42 requires a tax representative if the importer isn't actually established, doesn't have a base, in the state of import, state A.
Right, so if a German company imports via Rotterdam, they might need a Dutch tax rep.
Exactly. Now, the key problem is that the rules for appointing these reps, for monitoring them, and crucially, for requiring financial guarantees from them, these rules are not harmonized across the EU at all.
Not harmonized. Can you give some hard examples of that difference, particularly on the guarantee requirements? That seems vital.
Absolutely. And this really is the definition of a fragmented customs shield. Look at this.
Yeah.
In Belgium, an importer using CP42 must provide a fixed guarantee of 7,500 years.
Okay, 7,500.
France requires an amount based on the company's financial solvency, so it varies. However, countries like Slovenia and, wait for it, Ireland require no guarantee at all to appoint a tax representative for CP42.
Hold on. Ireland, a major entry point for goods into the EU, requires zero financial guarantee for a procedure that, as we've heard, can lose the EU potentially hundreds of millions in tax revenue.
Correct. Zero guarantee required in Ireland or Slovenia for appointing a CP42 tax rep.
That seems, well, it seems like an active invitation for criminals to set up shop there, doesn't it? Target those specific entry points?
It is precisely that. Why risk having to post a guarantee in Belgium or France when you can enter through Ireland or Slovenia with zero financial skin in the game?
So criminals minimize their exposure.
They minimize their financial exposure and maximize their ability to just disappear after the goods are released from customs. This lack of uniformity isn't a bug. It's become a feature for fraudsters. It's a direct administrative failure, creating the economic incentive for criminals to bypass responsible states and deliberately target the weak links.
Okay, beyond just the guarantees, which is shocking enough, the European Court of Auditors apparently detailed serious operational failures in the actual control mechanisms for CP42. What were the most damning audit findings there?
Oh, the findings reveal a stunning lack of internal communication and follow-through. I mean, really basic stuff. Get this. None of the 5 audited member states systematically cross-checked the customs, import data, the official record of what came in under CP42.
Right, the declaration at import.
Against the necessary VAP recapitulative statements. Those are the documents that are supposed to show where the VAT was eventually paid in the destination state, State B.
They don't cross-check them systematically.
No, which means there's essentially no functioning mechanism to ensure the supply actually got taxed where it was supposed to. It's flying blind.
How significant is that failure rate? I mean, how often does it go wrong?
It's highly significant. The audit looked at a sample of CP42 cases and found that VAT was simply not charged or accounted for in 27% of the transactions they examined.
27%, more than 1 in 4 transactions, just slip through untaxed.
That's what the sample showed. And that resulted in confirmed losses of around 2.6 million in that small sample alone. Imagine scaling that up. It's not just a procedural mistake, it's evidence of a massive systemic blind spot.
And what about follow-up? Once the goods are released from the port under CP42, is there any real control over where they physically go? Do they check the transport documents?
Minimal to none, according to the audits. Most countries audited do not conduct the necessary post-release controls. They don't sufficiently check the transport evidence, the proof that the goods actually moved from state A to their declared destination in state B. Which dramatically increases the risk of the goods being immediately diverted onto the black market right there in the state of importation, state A, entirely untaxed, having used CP42 simply as a cover.
Okay, let's pivot now to the second major vulnerability you mentioned. iOS, the import one-stop shop. This is critical, as you said, in the age of global e-commerce, the massive flood of low-value imports.
Absolutely. The iOS is designed specifically for e-commerce goods valued under $158. The idea is the seller collects the VAT up front from the consumer at the point of sale online.
Right, like when you buy something from overseas website.
Exactly. And then the seller remits all that collected VAT via a single monthly return to one EU tax authority, which then distributes it. It's meant to be simple.
But it's being abused.
Yeah. Primarily through three methods, all again relying on misrepresentation. First, criminal traders get hold of and use the iOS identification numbers of legitimate established sellers to benefit from the customs duty exemption and simplified clearance fraudulently.
So identity theft, basically, but for tax numbers.
Kind of, yes. Second, they artificially split large consignments into multiple smaller packages to ensure each one stays below that 150 kilo threshold for iOS eligibility.
Okay, breaking bulk to cheat the system.
Correct. And third, and this is a huge one, they engage in deliberate, sometimes extreme, undervaluation of the goods themselves on the declaration.
Give us an example of that extreme undervaluation, something that really illustrates the sheer audacity of the crime.
Okay, well, the sources reference detected cases involving things you'd expect to have significant value: smartphones, textiles, shoes, jewelry. But the most extreme example cited involves a smartphone. It was detected in Belgium, being imported under iOS.
Yeah.
And it was deliberately declared at a customs value of just 0.01.
1 single cent for a smartphone.
1 cent. This isn't an accounting error, clearly. It's a blatant attempt to minimize or completely eliminate any potential duties and taxes owed, exploiting the simplified iOS process.
And what are the deficiencies in control that allow a customs agent, presumably, to look at a package containing a smartphone declared at 1 cent and just let it through?
Well, the fundamental flaw seems to be in the real-time control mechanism. Customs authorities at the border can only verify the validity of the iOS number itself against a central database. They can check if the number exists and is active.
But they can't check who is actually using it.
Not in real time, no. They can't instantly verify the identity of the operator behind that number. So if a number is stolen or being fraudulently used by someone else, the system at the point of import can't necessarily flag that instantly.
And what about catching the undervaluation, like the 1 cent smartphone?
That relies heavily on post-release audits, checking things after the goods have entered. But the audits found that these crucial post-release checks were lacking in most of the audited member states. Authorities tended to focus narrowly on whether some VAT was collected via iOS, rather than rigorously verifying if the conditions for using the scheme, like the actual value being under €150, were met in the first place.
So another gap in the follow-through.
Another gap.
Okay. We've really established now that the crime is executed by internal actors, European companies, exploiting these internal systems and their weaknesses. However, the media narrative, and indeed that initial press conference story, often centers the blame on the origin of the goods, typically pointing fingers at countries like China.
Yes, that happens a lot.
But the single biggest customs fraud scandal in recent memory related specifically to this kind of undervaluation. It points squarely at a spectacular failure of internal enforcement in a key member state, doesn't it? The United Kingdom, long before it left the Union.
That's absolutely right. And what's fascinating here is how the UK's, let's call it administrative laxity, particularly from around 2011 to 2017, essentially created a system that was almost impossible not to exploit if you were engaged in this kind of fraud.
How so? What did OLAF find?
OLAF's investigations into textile and footwear undervaluation fraud found that fraudsters systematically targeted the United Kingdom. Why? Because its customs system was simply not putting in place effective controls. They weren't maintaining their part of the common customs shield.
How was the UK a weak link specifically in that case? What weren't they doing?
They lacked a forceful, proactive control strategy for high-risk goods, like textiles coming from certain origins. And most importantly, they consistently failed to request adequate financial guarantees to cover potential duty losses in these high-risk categories.
No guarantees again. Sounds familiar.
Exactly the same pattern. And this created what investigators explicitly called a traffic diversion.
Traffic diversion.
Yes. If you look at the trade data for that period, Chinese imports of textiles and footwear surged dramatically into the UK. At the exact same time, imports of the same goods were actually decreasing in other EU states that had more rigorous controls.
So criminals were actively rerouting their imports through the UK.
Intentionally selecting the UK as the path of least resistance into the entire EU single market, because they knew the checks were weaker and the financial risks, like guarantees, were lower.
What was the financial outcome of this systematic failure by the UK?
The financial fallout was immense. The infringement resulted in confirmed losses of 2.7 billion euros.
2.7 billion.
Billion.
Yeah.
Just to the EU budget in lost customs duties alone. And that figure doesn't even include the vast associated VAT losses, which would be on top of that.
Wow. And who was held responsible for that?
Well, because the UK had fundamentally failed to enforce the common EU rules, the European Commission held the UK liable for that entire amount. It led to a long, complex legal battle before the CJEU.
That case seems to demonstrate definitively, doesn't it, that the core structural issue isn't necessarily where the goods came from, but the internal discrepancy in control. One member state's failure effectively nullified the protection for the entire continent.
Precisely. It shows crystal clear how the non-harmonized and, frankly, uncoordinated application of common EU legislation, a failure of internal governance, is the primary enabler of this kind of large-scale fraud. It doesn't really matter if the goods originate in China or Vietnam or anywhere else. The crime is only viable on this scale because a European customs authority, in this case the UK's, failed to act as an effective barrier.
This whole issue of undervaluation, like the 1 cent smartphone or the textiles, it raises a specific practical problem. How do customs authorities even determine the true value of goods when the importer is deliberately lying on the paperwork, if you can't trust the invoice?
That is the core legal and practical struggle. Internationally, the World Trade Organization's Customs Valuation Agreement, the CVA, mandates that customs authorities should rely primarily on the transaction value.
The actual price paid or payable.
Exactly. Which is great for legitimate trade, encourages predictability, but it's a potential disaster when you're dealing with systematic fraud, because the transaction value is precisely what is being misrepresented by the criminals.
So how did OLF try to combat this in the UK case, especially when the goods had already been released and probably sold, making physical verification impossible? You can't exactly recall millions of pairs of shoes.
No, you can't. OLF had to get creative, essentially. They developed a methodology based on statistical analysis.
Yeah.
They used the Eurostat COMEX database, which tracks EU trade,
Right.
to calculate a cleaned average price, or CAP, for specific categories of goods, like women's blouses from China, for example.
An average price based on legitimate trade data.
Yes, clean of anomalies.
Yeah.
They then established a threshold. They argued that any declared value falling below 50% of that cleaned average price was deemed the lowest acceptable price, or LAP.
LAP.
And any declaration below that LAP indicated a significant high risk of undervaluation that should have triggered more scrutiny or guarantees.
And was this statistical estimate, this LAP methodology, actually accepted by the court, given the WTO's preference for transaction value?
Yes. Importantly, it was accepted by the CJEU, specifically in that critical commission versus United Kingdom case we discussed.
Why did they accept it?
The court recognized that because the UK's physical controls had been so demonstrably inadequate, and because the goods couldn't be recalled for inspection, OLF's statistical methodology was an acceptable, albeit indirect, way to estimate the scale of the lost duties.
But it's a backstop, right? Not the ideal solution.
Absolutely. We must stress this. The OLAF method was a post hoc remedy. It was a way to calculate the damage after the internal system had already failed catastrophically. It is not the preferred preventative mechanism under international trade rules.
Okay. So, given all this evidence, from the inconsistent penalties and those zero guarantees under CP42 to that shocking 27% failure rate in basic cross-checks and the 2.7 billion lesson of the UK's failure, it seems crystal clear that the EU requires deep internal regulatory reform, not just, better external surveillance or blaming trade partners.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It really raises the essential question, doesn't it? If member states cannot even cooperate effectively internally, between their own customs and tax authorities,
Yeah.
how can they ever hope to successfully fight sophisticated, organized, cross-border crime that is specifically designed to exploit those very internal regulatory seams and inconsistencies? The current fragmented system almost seems to actively frustrate its own anti-fraud efforts.
Tell us more about that cooperation deficit. What does that bureaucratic nightmare actually look like on the ground for investigators trying to chase this fraud?
Well, it's often defined by these cumbersome, incredibly indirect communication paths. Imagine a tax authority in Spain detects a suspicious transaction involving goods imported via France. They need the customs data from France to confirm their suspicions.
Okay, makes sense.
But the request often cannot go directly from Spanish tax to French customs. No. It might have to go from Spanish tax up to Spanish customs, who then formally sends it across to French customs. French customs then finds the info, sends the reply back through French customs, which goes back to Spanish customs, who finally sends it down to the Spanish tax authority that asked in the first place.
That sounds incredibly slow, like a system designed for the 19th century postal service, not modern digital financial enforcement.
It's fatally slow. This multi-step, multinational relay race is inherently time-consuming. And it fatally slows down the prompt detection needed to, for example, invalidate those fraudulent VAT numbers before that 20% loss window we talked about is hit. It allows criminals to keep operating while the authorities are passing paper between themselves.
Okay, so faced with this systemic incoherence, what specific regulatory changes did the European Court of Auditors, the ECA, recommend? They must have had concrete proposals to address this.
They did. And the ECA recommendations focus entirely, laser-like, on closing the specific structural holes we've been discussing all along. They proposed 4 major legislative revisions to strengthen the common framework.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, introduce standardized, harmonized rules for tax representative appointments and guarantees under CP42. This is absolutely non-negotiable to prevent that import point shopping and ensure uniform financial accountability across all EU entry points. You have to remove the incentive to seek out the weakest link.
Makes sense. Close the guarantee loophole. What's second?
Second, they said the EU must create standardized rules for the immediate and timely invalidation or suspension of fraudulent VAT identification numbers in the VIES system. Close that costly, damaging lag time that criminals exploit. Make it fast.
Right, cut off their ability to operate once detected. And the third recommendation, did it address that bureaucratic relay race?
Yes. Third, they said the EU must mandate the direct, immediate exchange of information between the tax and customs authorities of different member states. Cut out the middlemen, eliminate those slow, indirect routes. That's essential for fighting rapid, cross-border financial crime effectively.
Direct contact. Okay. And the fourth?
And fourth, a potentially quite powerful one. They recommended granting Eurofisc, that's the anti-fraud network itself, the competence to actually suspend VAT identification numbers autonomously itself when there are strong indicators of fraud.
So Eurofisc could act directly.
Yes, rather than having to wait for a potentially unwilling or just very slow national authority to finally take action. Give the central network some teeth.
These recommendations, taken together, they all seem to point toward one ultimate conclusion, don't they? That the fragmented customs management model itself, where 27 different authorities do things slightly differently, is the fundamental failure.
That is the inescapable conclusion you draw from the evidence, yes. The ultimate suggestion, the one that logically follows from all these failures, is the potential creation of a single, unified European customs agency.
A single agency for the whole bloc.
That's the idea. It's seen by proponents as potentially the only way to truly ensure uniform checks, consistent risk assessment, and harmonized enforcement across all member states. The only way to finally overcome the structural deficit where member states retain their own disparate and, as we've seen, often easily exploited risk and control systems.
We started this deep dive with that very dramatic story, didn't we? An industrial-scale invasion, orchestrated by sophisticated external networks, costing taxpayers almost €1 billion in just a single fraud scheme.
We did. And I think we conclude, looking at the details, that the real financial drain isn't primarily the ingenuity of foreign criminals operating from thousands of miles away. It's the gaping, non-harmonized vulnerabilities and, frankly, the deliberate lack of timely cooperation and consistent enforcement baked right into the EU's own customs administration model.
So the crime happens here.
The evidence shows the crime is committed in a European port, it's signed off by a European company, and it's facilitated, ultimately, by a lack of internal political and administrative will across the bloc to enforce the common rules uniformly and effectively. The internal failure isn't merely a subplot. When you dig into it, it really is the entire story.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the hidden complexities of trade fraud and European governance.